Thanks for coming out, everybody. We appreciate you guys being here. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and faces we haven't met before. And thanks so much for Malaprops and all the staff here for having us. We really appreciate them as well. They're one of the premier indie bookstores in the nation. And ain't nobody does it better than us, Malaprops. I'm Polly Schattel. This is Julyan Davis. This is kind of a weird event because we are doing a shared event, and we come from, say, two very different places. I'm a Southerner. I was born in Alabama, in the dark heart of the South. And even though I'm pretty much from Birmingham, I grew up in a little town just north of Birmingham called Jasper, Alabama, if anybody knows Jasper. And so to give it, to give you an idea of how rough Jasper was, when I was in college, my English professor was a New York Times correspondent. He was all over the world. He covered wars in Central America. He was in Nicaragua, embedded with the troops and all that. And at one time, somebody asked him, "Where's the scariest place you've ever been?" And this guy said, "Jasper, Alabama." And everybody was like, "Jasper, Alabama, that's like an hour away from here. What's so scary about that?" And he said, basically, you could get somebody killed for $200 in Jasper, Alabama. And he was right. And and I apologize to my friends in Jasper. I have some friends there and family, but it's a mean town, man. And so I kind of consider myself a child of the South. And I don't necessarily write Southern Gothic for reasons we'll get into in a little bit, but I do write about the South. The name of my production company is called, my film production company is called New Southern Films. And that kind of gives you an idea of where my head's at in terms of craft and art in the South. I think we're in the New South now. And so Julyan and I wanted to have a joint, sort of a joint meeting so we could share our experiences with you too.
Yeah, I think it's great that I met Polly a few years ago and we had this connection through Alabama. It turns out that a great friend of mine, Norman McMillan, was actually your...
He was my English professor.
That's right.
And also my advisor. So we got to know each other fairly well.
That's right. And I knew Norman through a circle of writers, professors in Southwest Alabama. And Polly and I were talking recently about how interesting it is that she had been trying to escape the South, and that I was drawn to the South, having read this old book, Stars Fell on Alabama, when I was in college in art school. And I picked up this book, and I was reading about Alabama in the 30s, and I thought I would leave England and go on a short adventure to explore Alabama, particularly one story about Demopolis, the vine and olive colony. And yes, that basically introduced me to the South and to the literary South. And I've been here ever since. So it's been an interesting thing. I might just say at this point, we had discussed questions, and even at this early stage, if anyone has a question, do feel free to ask.
Or even some observations.
Yes.
Julyan, could you just repeat the name of the book and the author?
Yes, I'm just being asked to repeat the name of the book and the author. It's Stars Fell on Alabama, and
it's by Carl Carmer.
By Carl Carmer. And when Polly made a short film on my work in the South, she and I discussed this book at some length. Yeah.
What's it about?
It was a professor from the North who spent some time in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the 30s, and it's about his experiences of the history of the South, of Alabama.
So what's funny, excuse me, is that I was born in the South, and Julyan came halfway across the world to be in the South. And I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I love the South. I love everything about the South, but it's very dysfunctional, as we might agree. And but I even like that too. I mean, it's an interesting region. There's not only, you know, race and history, there's geology, there's all kinds of art. It's the birthplace of rock and roll, it's the birthplace of jazz. There's so much about the South to love. And of course, everybody gives it a real bad rap these days about, you know, well, the South is a separate country and we want to secede from the Union and all that stuff. But there is kind of a part where we really are still fighting the Civil War. You know, we're about what, 150, 160 years after that. How far are we after that?
I think so, something like that.
Yeah, so there's still some sort of remnants of that battle happening even today, even in the MAGA times.
Mhm.
And so we thought it would be kind of interesting to get together and talk about that, because Julyan obviously has a very different take on the South. You know, he was attracted to its messiness. Is that correct?
That is true. I was attracted to I was very inspired by the paintings of Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth, and I was looking for a sort of derelict part of America. I'd also, To Kill a Mockingbird was a required reading, I think in 8th grade in England. And so, and of course, English television is full of American shows, and of course the cinemas are full of American cinemas. So we all in England grew up on American culture. So I was very excited to visit the South and paint that sort of decay, and then became more and more interested in the sort of dysfunctionality of the South. So I think particularly through the literature, and that's been an increasing inspiration for me in my narrative work.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir, back there.
Well, just like the word dysfunction, you both used the word dysfunction, just both almost like 5 minutes apart. And what is like one example, for instance, of dysfunction to, I mean, there's probably many, but what is just one example of what you mean by that word?
Yeah, I can answer. The question there was, can we give an example of the dysfunctionality of the South? One thing particularly for me is the trauma that came with particularly the Scots-Irish from the old country, the centuries of trauma. There's that level of, and a lot of historians now talk about that level of trauma. I was talking to Polly recently and saying that perhaps if one was to diagnose the South as a sort of therapist, you could say that it might have borderline personality disorder. One of the traits of borderline personality disorder, or the symptom at the beginning starts of it, are genetic trauma, which is something people talk about coming from the old country, centuries of violence, particularly on the Scottish borders. And then the idea of an invalidated childhood, I think that's the therapy term for it, this sense of some damage or trauma in one's early roots. There's that, and I think we also talked about the Civil War as this unsolved or this perpetuating skeleton in the closet. As I say, really with the South, you can't even see the closet for the skeletons. Yeah, so there's an example.
Well, I mean, there's a guy riding around here in a pickup truck with a Union Jack, I don't know, Union Jack,
A Confederate flag.
Confederate flag in the back waving, as he drives around. He'll drive just to show it off. I mean, he drives down one block and circles around, you'll see him around this area driving, some days. I saw him yesterday, but it's been going on. He drives for 2 or 3 years up in where that.
The South will rise again.
Yeah, but he's kind of an oddball. But anyway, is there one more example you could pull out?
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of the South, what happened was, of course, we were settled here in the Appalachians in particular by the Scotch-Irish. And the Scotch-Irish, like he was saying, came from over there in a state of trauma. And they came over here already traumatized by what was happening in the UK at the time. I mean, Ireland and Scotland were originally, it's like Celtic people, all the Gaelic people and things like that. And they were colonized by the English. And so what happened was you had a community that was already in trauma. Then they immigrated here to the US, and they weren't, solved of their trauma at the time. And now they're sort of re-inflicting that trauma on others. So we have, racism. It's kind of it's a notoriously sort of brutal region. You see a lot of outlaws and thieves and brigands and things like that in the Appalachians. And so, what you're seeing are these patterns of trauma again and again and again. And, and of course, every region has trauma. New York City has trauma. Oregon has trauma. Like Santa Fe has trauma. But at the same time, the South is the only region of the United States that ever lost a war up until, say, like Vietnam or something, or Korea, I don't know. But it's one of those things where we haven't healed from the original sin of America's racism. We're still fighting that battle after all this time. We never apologized for it. We never said, okay, we're sorry, that was wrong, let's move on. We just kind of, threw it under the rug. So we haven't had a chance to heal down here in the South. And so this trauma keeps happening again and again and again. And through losing the Civil War, it threw so much into poverty, it upended our economy, it upended our whole civilization down here, really. So we've been recovering from that ever since. And that's sort of how we entered into a very dysfunctional space.
Yeah, you've mentioned the man driving around with a Confederate flag. I find it very interesting, the idea of the lost cause, the fact that basically the South decided, as the only part of the English-speaking world, to continue with the economy of slavery, and then upon losing the war, to turn that to the whole point that Shelby Foote made, that he said that when a Union soldier approached a Confederate and said, "Why are you fighting?" He said, "We're fighting because you're down here." This is the lost cause taking on the idea of states' rights. And I think that idea of not really, it hasn't been addressed. And of course, then with the Jim Crow laws and later with segregation, it is this giant lurking problem. If you imagine it as a family history, I think that's what, I don't know, I feel that that's always been behind. It's like the great dark secret, and then all the other sort of family secrets of the South are laid upon that. So it's this, for an artist, it just provides this incredibly dense back history for any kind of story. It doesn't even have to be mentioned. I don't think, I have not addressed the Civil War directly in my work. I don't know if you have.
I haven't, no.
Yeah, so it's more this bigger backstory that it just, I think artists are just seeking drama. I mean, people have said to me since I first came to Alabama and then moved to Georgia and up to North Carolina, people have said, what are you doing there? I mean, people back in England, why are you not here? Why are you not living, why are you not sitting in a coffee shop in Denmark or something?
Or Soho.
Or Soho, yeah. And it's because this is where I get my inspiration. So I would much rather be in a place that has that. I will say that it's not as exciting as the South has become more and more gentrified. It is not quite as rewarding a place to find subject matter. I mean, just in terms of the things I paint, for example, I just went down to Charleston. I painted Charleston in the late 90s. There's now nothing in downtown Charleston that I would want to paint. It's all been gentrified. It's all very expensive. It's no longer of interest to me. That's why I don't still live in Bath or paint the Cotswolds. I came over here to paint decay and wreckage.
The Old South has passed away finally.
Have you ever thought of 1963 when a president from the Boston area went to Dallas, Texas, in the South, and got shot and killed before the civil rights movement actually got taken off, and they were kind of approaching the civil rights thing at that point. But somebody from the New England area goes down to the south to the Texas in a motorcade and gets shot.
He's asking about the Kennedy assassination and whether that's part of the sort of, all of the problems of the South. And I would say it's part of the same cloth. It's definitely part of that vast quilt, the crazy quilt of what the South is, and all of the problems that, that happened then or are still happening today. I mean, basically, the Old South has died, and I say good riddance myself. I know it's not so great in terms of inspiration, but me, I like therapy. I like hospitals. I like, services that I can use and access. So it's a good thing for some people, but it's definitely not good for art. A lot of the reason why he and I shared the same sort of vibe is we love the Gothic South. We love Southern Gothic. And what does that mean? Like, what does Southern Gothic mean? Well, I think we have to kind of define our terms a little bit. Southern Gothic, of course, refers to Gothic literature, which came of age sort of in the 1700s and 1800s. I guess Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto, and that was considered the first Gothic novel. And it was so called because they used things from the Gothic era, like castles. They used dark, like, I don't even know, like some like crazy places in England and the old world, just to create a mood. It was very haunted from the past and very atmospheric. And so when a lot of the writers of the Gothic South, Flannery O'Connor, who else is a Gothic?
Carson McCullers.
Carson McCullers.
Yeah.
There's even, some newer.
Oh yes, yeah, locally.
Yeah. And so a lot of people talk about the Gothic South, Southern Gothic. And I think it's an interesting thing, but in my opinion, it's an idea that has kind of passed away. Its time has come and gone. It was haunted by race. Flannery O'Connor called it the Christ-haunted South. I think even that's gone. So we're talking now about the new South, and that's where we live now. Atlanta is one of the biggest cities in America. It's the new Hollywood. And so with the internet, with interstate travel, there's so many more, there's ways in which the isolation of the Old South has gone away. We're no longer a primarily rural region. And so, as Julyan says, it's a little bit less interesting artistically, but there's more going on in terms of healing and in terms of, like I say, services that are offered these days. So, So in other words, the Old South, the Gothic South is dead and good fucking riddance. So, yes.
So is there any place in this new world for somebody like Faulkner? Is he just dead? One of the greatest writers this country's ever produced. Is there a place for him anymore? Especially in academia. Will he ever be assigned anymore?
Yes. We asked, is there any place anymore for a great author like Faulkner? Well, I think locally, we've got people like Lauren Rash, and in terms of the of darker subject matter and things. So I think there is that place for that kind of art. I don't know how big the audience is. It's possible too that I don't know, it's possible the drama of that kind of world has perhaps, you know, vanished with gentrification. That's a great question.
I think there is. I mean, obviously he's one of the giants of the genre, and he will always be taught. I mean, he'll always be around, but I don't know if anybody is going to write like Faulkner. You know, there are some modern people. There's Cormac McCarthy, who's still doing some sort of Southern Gothic, and there are other people. But in my view, those stories have been told now. You know, I don't think there's going to be another Faulkner or another Flannery O'Connor. I don't know if Eudora Welty was ever really Southern Gothic, because she didn't really traffic in the grotesque as much as those other guys did. But I think he will always be taught. There will always be a place for Faulkner, but I don't necessarily know if there's going to be any new Faulknerian narratives coming out.
Well, I didn't mean that. I just meant him as an individual and a non-realm as far as an artist. Like, where is he and what is he being now? As a kind of a touchdown.
He's a historical figure, you know. I mean, as Hemingway is, and as a lot of those people are. I mean, they are of their time. They're universal. They're great. They're wonderful. They'll always be taught. But yeah, the era. Say, for instance, Flannery O'Connor. I mean, you know, her stuff dealt with race so much, and racism is kind of gone now. Not racism is gone, certainly not. I'm not saying that, but I am saying race in that way, that's gone now. I think it was of its time, and we've moved on as a society. Yes.
Where does Asheville fit in terms of point of view? Because I don't see Asheville as the same as like Alabama or,
No, that's the question. The question is, where does Asheville fit into that view of the overall view of the South? And I agree. I think Asheville is definitely different. Rather like Austin is different in Texas. I found it interesting. When I first got here, it was more colorful, and I did find that inspiring myself. You know, the sort of people. I would say that that part of me that is a sort of moth/candle expert. I would say that I am tired of drama, and perhaps my novel was a point in my career where, having done the paintings of the murder ballads, which are all about high drama, and I did reach a point of exhaustion, and perhaps my novel was a way for me to take a light-hearted look at what a certain type of drama that Asheville had more 20 years ago, but 10, 15 years ago. But I do feel that's decreasing. I do feel Asheville's personality is becoming vaguer. Yes.
Does that shift have to do with the more fairy tale, fanciful aspects coming into your paintings these days? Was writing the novel part of that shift in subject matter for your paintings?
Yes. The question is, does the recent change in my paintings, has that been affected by the novel and that change of view? Yes, although I will say that I've started a new series that is basically a telling of American history. It's almost like it's going to have a lot of darkness in it, but the form of it is more playful in appearance. It's more like a sort of bedtime story for my son, following three women characters, three women ghosts through American history from the Gold Rush up to the Great Depression. But yeah, I realized that I needed to be more of a storyteller, actually. So it's a sort of doubling down on what I learned from having written the novel. And I learned a lot of the power of satire, actually. I do believe quite a lot in satire as a way to address what one might want to change in society. Yeah.
Julyan, so
this is your first novel?
Yes.
You came to the South and you were drawn to the South through literature that you read. You've been exploring your art through painting. Did you ever write before? I know you're telling stories through your painting, write poetry, or is it all through your art before this novel?
The question was, had I done any writing before this novel, or was it all through my art? I had not really published anything. I did come over when I first came to Alabama and was interested in Demopolis. I had actually thought about that as a novel. And I have always written poetry and short stories and maybe even a few screenplays, but no, this is the first thing I've submitted for publication. The question was, what about my Hanger Hall book?
Didn't you write a book about it?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't write a book about that. I did paint it. Yeah.
His father was a celebrated novelist in London. So he came from sort of a literary background.
Yes, I was going to say one thing about talking about the drama of the South. One thing we talked about Jasper and all these places. One thing that was very interesting to me was this culture of honor that came over from the Scottish borders, and that's what my whole series of murder ballad paintings was about. And that's something that I find it's fascinating. There's a great book, actually, a little book on the culture of honor in the South and how the South differs from other parts of the country in terms of things like suicide. It's much higher in the South, certain types of crime. And the culture of honor is basically this code by people on the Scottish borders who for 300 years were living in absolute chaos, while England and Scotland were fighting wars in and using their land as basically the battlefield for centuries. So the culture of honor is about being very hospitable when you basically, there's lots of music, there's lots of poetry, and it's very hospitable as long as they know who you are. But if they don't, there's a lot of feuding, blood feuds and things like that. So I was talking about it, I think you and I were talking about it, the filmmaker, Canadian filmmaker who was shot in Kentucky back in the 60s, who went up to someone's door. That was very much a culture of honor thing, that he was on this person's property. If it had been a slightly different situation, he would have been welcomed in, but unfortunately he approached the house in a certain way and he was shot instead. So that's an extreme example of the extremes of the culture of honor.
I have a question for you. So your book, question of a history of saints.
Yeah.
How does that deal with the South? Like, what's Southern about the history of saints? A history of saints. What is uniquely Southern about that book? What question were you wrestling with, and what problem were you trying to solve by setting that book in this in the American South?
I'm not sure if it was particularly Southern. I think it was very particular to Asheville, but the broader South, I don't think it was. Yeah, no, it was more about the world I'd encountered in Asheville. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Is there such a, I'm sorry, is there such a category that this fits into, like historical fiction? Was there
this is a question regarding my book, The History of Saints. Yes, the question was, does it fit into a certain genre? It's sort of gentle satire, it's humor.
It's funny as hell.
It's basic. I wanted to write, I had a rather difficult experience during the Great Recession of 2008, and I ended up walking away from my house. It was too difficult to keep it with a constantly changing house full of tenants. And so I wanted to write something that was sort of, I don't know, it's a gentle a gentle satire about the type, the Asheville at that time, the sort of people, and it was inspired by people like P.G. Wodehouse. It was meant to be very light and very a fast read. Yeah, and it was a way for me to look back on quite a difficult time and just see the lighter side of it, you know, to make something positive of it. Yes.
Holly, can you talk a little bit about your written work and how it's oddly being similar in terms of being funny while also being really scary?
Sure. A lot of my written work is mostly classified as horror, even though I would call it like, say dark fantasy or something like that. It's not real traditional horror, but it is set in the South, because as a person who grew up in the South, it's gold to use as grist for my mill. It's really a great way to communicate ideas. I've got this authenticity in my history. So I love the South. I want to write about the South, but it's not the Gothic South. What I do is I write about the modern South. And it's not necessarily even self-consciously Southern, but it is set in the South and often the rural South, because I know it. I know it. I live here by choice. I'm fascinated by the South. I love the South. And there's a richness here that just feels so almost inexpressible. It's like an endless well of material you can draw from, whether it's music or culture or art or painting or literature. There's always something else to bring to the fore in your work. And as far as humor goes, my last book, 82959, even I forget that the name of my own book. I'll never write another book with numbers as the title. That'll never happen again. I just wanted to put some humor in there. There's a lot of similarities between humor and horror, as we all know. I mean, it's sort of a visceral reaction. It's hard to explain what's going on there. And if you have to explain it, you've killed it. And the same thing is true with horror. I mean, you want to, sort of bring about a visceral reaction in your reader to terrify them. And so it's just a lot of fun to play with these ideas and these themes that are still sort of, still happening in the South. There's poverty, there's lack of education, there's the racism, of course, I mentioned that earlier. There's isolation in the South. We're still largely rural in a lot of ways, in some ways not. But so you can sort of, grab at those old ideas, but most of the time you can't go back to those old gloomy, plantation houses or things like that, because somebody's bought it and fixed it up, and now it's an Airbnb, but you can still, there's hints of it here and there. And that's what Julyan would do, is he would paint these sort of decrepit old warehouses and train tracks and, rivers that had, like graffiti on all the bridges and things like that. He had a really interesting take on the Old South and the New South and where the two sort of met.
I think, Polly, her films have a very similar set. A lot of the settings, the lighting, I think we're both influenced by certain types of American cinema and certain types of cinematography. So yeah, I think that's a shared thing. I was going to ask, what sort of influences do you have with your new turn towards writing?
With my fiction?
Yeah.
It's hard to say because it's all over the map. I mean, Raymond Carver, Flannery O'Connor, Stephen King, of course. There's some horror greats that I reread, Straub, just a lot of different people, but I like Michael Chabon a lot. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily have to go back 100 years or anything like that. It can definitely be something newer. But, as long as you are able to craft that authentic voice, then I think you'll do pretty good.
Yeah. It's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting that Holly and I have both changed genres. You know, we changed from, in your case, from filmmaking to writing, and in my case, from painting to writing. I mean, I'm still painting, but I think my paintings are going to become more and more narrative. In fact, the current series does have an accompanying novel that I'm writing sort of after the paintings. But yes, it's just interesting that we've both crossed genres.
our art was too big to actually be stuck in one medium. We had to cross mediums, you know.
Yeah.
He's a brilliant painter. I'm not a brilliant filmmaker, but we love to write. So
Well, I had a question there.
I've often thought that cinema is a great influence on me, but you're also, the other aspect of it is you're doing this narrative painting at a time when that's not necessarily, do you have allies? Do you have shared influences in contemporary art?
The question is, do I have other people in contemporary art on the same wavelength as my current work? Is that it? Not that I can think of, no.
he's a man alone.
No, this is very much unique.
He's outstanding in his field.
Yeah, I had quite a time. I was just in Charleston trying to explain the premise of painting a novel, and also painting a novel that's not plotted, which is even more peculiar. So it is literally each painting will create the next painting, and down the road the painting provokes writing. But yeah, it's unusual.
I love that his new work is still set in America, and the subject is still America. He's fascinated by the U.S. for some reason.
Yeah. Well, my son is American, and yes, I think quite often, you know, he's a Southerner. He's an American, and I think I just hope he has. I don't know. This particular series is very much about giving him some grounding. I'm not sure about the level of history he's being taught. I think it could help him. When I did a talk recently about the murder ballads, and it was very interesting afterwards that I was talking about the culture of honor and the borders and what had come over this trauma. And this lady came up afterwards and said, thank you so much. I didn't know that all these behaviors and these patterns she said, I always thought we started them. It was like an American issue, violence, and she was very grateful to know that no, it had begun. And I said, well, really, it goes back to Cain and Abel. It goes back a long way.
It's human nature, really.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. You had a.
Yeah, I was curious, because the South has such a unique spiritual culture or religious culture, if that's affected any of your writing.
I try to stay away from, that religious extremism. I grew up in it, and I never handled snakes or anything like that, but I definitely did grow up in sort of a Methodist church-going culture. And, it's in my estimation, it's kind of been done. You know what I mean? We've seen it now. So I'm always looking for the next thing. I'm looking for the story that has not been told yet. So I think there's so many great writers who took on religion. Flannery O'Connor, again, is one who did that so well. And so I just kind of think that if I'm going to go up against Flannery O'Connor, I'm going to get my ass kicked. So I'm always looking for the next story, the other story, the untold story. That's kind of how I approach it. So I haven't done that. It's not to say it won't happen, because it is wonderfully weird and sort of grotesque in its own way. But yeah, it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I think religion, I don't think religion has showed up in my writing. I've certainly painted lots of, handmade religious billboards and things. And it does make me very philosophical, theological, just driving, as I do a lot of driving through the South. And every time I see one of these billboards with this, out on the interstate or something, the absolute conviction of the message always puts me in a sort of philosophical mood and thinking about life after death and stuff like that. I would say that Southern outsider art, folk art, has been a huge influence on my work. Just the idea of, and I hadn't encountered this at all in England, but this idea of just making art no matter what, you just make art and put it out in your yard. And I think that's fantastic. So yeah, that's an ongoing inspiration.
What's interesting about Julian is he had a pretty international education. He went to school in China as a kid. Have you ever wanted to approach China as a regional subject for your art?
No,
Anything
I
like
haven't,
that?
no, I'm afraid not.
Why not?
Well, I went to, for one thing, I remember I went to school in Hong Kong, and I did A-level art in school, and I remember doing a whole project about the juxtaposition of the ghettos, the shanty towns with these luxury apartments next to them, and I sent that back to England for my A-levels. This was the end of high school, and I got an F. And I pitched a fit. I mean, I behaved very badly.
Why did they give you an F?
I don't know.
Was it the subject matter or was it the technique?
I don't know, but it put me off painting China for sure. Yeah, no, I don't know. I was shocked. I retook the exam and did better, but it was the beginning of a series of disappointments, and that may have been part of I had a very hard time getting into any art school, and was not very successful in art school at the end of art school.
Why is that?
I'm not sure. I think I could say it was just they failed to notice my talent, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I was. I don't know. My work was quite traditional, and I probably was quite arrogant. I think looking back on it, I've back in touch with all the people at art school, and they were I get a sense from the teachers that I was probably a little bit arrogant, actually. So anyway, I don't know, but I maybe that's the reason I came to America, but I'm glad I did.
The thing I love about Julian's work in his book and his paintings is he draws from a deeper well than most, say contemporary artists. He's drawing from 200 years ago, 300 years ago, things that may seem, sort of traditional now, but, his contemporaries are the greats of the early 20th century. They're not whoever's hot this year or this month or whatever. He's looking farther back than most artists are. And so he's kind of a man out of his time in a way, because it's I would say it might be a little anachronistic. Would you agree with that? Your approach to art?
It's very anachronistic. Yes. That's okay. That's fine.
It's not modern art.
No. It's not political either, really. It's another thing. The art world is very, very political now, and very subjective. And I think my work I sort of buried my personal feelings and personal history into the work. It's not right out front. It's not all paintings about my own trauma or family trauma.
Right, your paintings aren't a billboard.
They're not a billboard now.
Holly, would you be willing to talk a little bit about your latest book and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. My latest book, I think I talked about it a little bit.
So,
85929 is actually a novella. I've been really fortunate to work with a publisher called JournalStone. And for some reason, they love my work and I love them, and I've been very lucky to work with them. But it's rare to have a novella published all alone. I was expecting it to be part of a collection or something like that. And they wanted to put it out on its own. So who am I to say no? I let them do it. But consequently, it's a very slim novel. It's a very slim book. But yeah, it's basically a revenge tale and a murder tale about a teacher who decides to call hell upon her boss and have her boss consigned to hell so she can take his job. And it is sort of a comedy of errors. I think it's more of a black comedy than it is, a horror story. I mean, supposedly you'll laugh during the book. I hope you do. But it still has some supernatural elements. It still has some elements where you'll cringe a little bit on purpose. And I just had, I had the most fun writing it. It's one of those few things. I mean, most of my writing process is pretty torturous. It took years to write my first book and combing over each word, each comma. But this book came out really fast because I was just having a fucking blast with it. I was having so much fun. And it kind of spoiled me because now I want my next book to be like that too. And it's already not, I have to say. It's hard. But yeah, it was just so much fun. So I think when you're having that much fun, it's going to be readable and people are going to enjoy it.
Yeah, I would say Polly writes the way I do. I'm a rather, writing for me is quite hard work, but painting to me is really a joy. And Polly is amazingly prolific as a writer. So I think, I can tell you found your thing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I like fiction more than filmmaking in the sense that there's no interference. Filmmaking, there's a budget, there's weather, there's scheduling, there's casting, there's everything, there's all of it. And in fiction, there's just me. And I get to make all the decisions and there's no budget. And if it rains that day, it's okay too. And if it snows that day, that's no problem. So there's a freedom in fiction that there is not in filmmaking. Filmmaking is an inherently, say, commercial, thing. And so it's always fiction, but it's not quite as commercial. It doesn't have all those limitations on it.
Final questions from either the live audience or the virtual audience?
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
You guys are awesome. Great questions.